Hello everyone. I have been getting asked a lot lately what I use on the beach for sea run cutthroat trout. The answer is a bead head rolled muddler. So I figured I would just make a tying video and show you guys my favorite fly. The hook I'm using is a Marudo I-95 size 10. And on that I just put a very small gold brass bead. You really don't need to get much depth fishing for sea runs. In fact, you can fish them on the surface quite a bit. They like the shallow water, so putting a tungsten bead, for example, would just end up on the bottom. So you don't really want to do that. So smaller bead better, or even no bead sometimes. I use red thread. The reason for that I'll explain a little more later, but it stands out really nicely when you're tying these. So the first material I'm going to use after I've got my thread started here is I'm gonna tie in a little bit of mallard there, a little bit of mallard feather for the tail. So I'll show you what that looks like. So I cut sort of a small amount, sort of like so, and then I'm actually going to twist that like this so that they're not all sticking in the same direction, because what you don't want is to have them all sticking out the same way sideways on the tail. You actually want them coming straight back. So if you kind of twist them around, they'll stick straight back a little bit nicer. You can do that as much as you want or as little as you want, but and I like to not make this super long. I don't want to make it crazy long. A good rule of thumb is like maybe half of your hook shank here. So I'll do that, or even a bit shorter sometimes. I don't like a long tail myself, so I'm going to do pretty short. So I'm going to wrap that in all the way up the body, so when I tie up the body of the fly later, it's nice and even. As you can see, that's pretty short tail there. And the reason I like short is, although cutthroat generally are pretty aggressive, you do get the odd time where they're kind of just biting really soft, or there's another species I target with these flies, sea run dollies, on the North Island a little bit. And sometimes they bite really softly, so if you got a really long tail, you're just gonna miss those bites. So having that shorter tail there definitely is the way to go. So yeah, tie that all the way up the body. Just trim away this excess here. Throw it in your garbage, which is way over there. Next step for this is I'm actually going to take some red wire, like so. And I don't want you don't need too much. You don't need to wrap this up the body super tight. It's just to give it a bit of color and add a little bit of durability. So just a small piece, and I'm going to tie that right in at the front of my fly, like so there. So then I'll tie that down, wrap it all the way back to the tail, and then bring my thread back up there. Because the next thing I'm going to tie in is some mylar tinsel, and I'm getting kind of low on it here, but that's all right. When I'm doing a full body with mylar tinsel, I like the thicker mylar. You can get really thin ones, but they're not great for doing bodies because you got to wrap it like crazy. The really thin mylar is better if you're just doing like a ribbing up your fly. That's fine, but for wrapping the whole body, I really like the thicker stuff. So again, tie that in at the front, bring it all the way back, and then I'm going to bring my thread right up to the bead there again. Now I'm going to wrap my mylar forward all the way up the body of the fly there, like so. Trying to keep those wraps nice and tight together. You don't want them super loose either, because then it'll just get shredded really quick. The cutthroat have really sharp little teeth meant for shredding things, and if you got lots of this mylar just kind of sticking out loose, it'll just get shredded and ripped off pretty fast. So try to keep that nice and flush to the body of the hook there. And then I'll trim that off there, and this doesn't have to be super neat yet. You're gonna do some tie in there, so hopefully you can see that there. Nice, fairly even wraps. Again, don't have to be perfect. Fish don't care if your fly looks store-bought or if it looks like your first tie ever. They're probably gonna eat it. So now what I'm gonna do is take my red wire, and I'm going to wrap that the opposite way of the mylar. And the reason I go the opposite way is because I want it to essentially overlap that mylar. If I go the same way, it doesn't hold it down as well. So what this does is if I cross it with the mylars, it adds a lot of durability to that mylar. It's going to stay on there nicer. So wrap that all the way up, and you can do these as tight together or as far apart as you want, as many wraps as you want. It really isn't that big of a deal. I like to do 4 or 5 wraps just because I do like that added red color. So I'll just tie that down a little bit, and then use old scissors or whatever you want for cutting your wire. Don't use your nice scissors because wire will dull your scissors very fast. So I've got an old pair that I've retired. They've now become my wire scissors. Cut that off, and I'm going to just give it a bit of thread there, not too much. Flatten out that little wire tag in because that can fray your thread. A couple wraps, and then I'm good to move on. So the next step here is you're going to add some more mallard, and I'm going to do about the same amount as I did for my tail. The difference here is this is now the main part of your wing, right? And you can actually tie this fly without a mallard wing here. You can just use deer hair will be what goes in there next. I like the mallard because the deer hair gets shredded and ripped up really quickly. So having that mallard underneath it kind of just increases the lifespan of your fly, even if all that deer hair gets ripped out. And it just has a really nice kind of pattern that looks very similar to that of like par lines on a little fry or whatever you call those. So that's just a really good representation of that. So, and again, I'm going to do that twist. So kind of twist them around just to even them out. So they're all facing different directions. It's just going to make the fly a little more clean. Then I'm going to tie that in the same length as the tail. So I'm going to kind of measure that, pinch it there, and then I'm going to wrap it. And so mallard you can see if I wrap tight right away, it'll spin around. My thread kind of pushes it underneath. If I actually go up and over loosely, pull in a bit of thread, and I pull up, I can get it to stay where I want to better. So I'll show that again. So if you go loose around the top there, and then pull up, you can kind of put it where you want a little nicer, and it's not going to pull it underneath the fly at all. So then I'm just going to tie that in a little bit, give it a couple wraps. And I don't need, some guys like to go wraps behind and try to get it to stick up like that. You don't need to on this. I actually prefer it to lay fairly flat. And the reason for that is a lot of the fry, especially early in the spring when you get the pink salmon fry coming out of our local rivers here, the fry are very small. So I like a small, sparse profile when I'm fishing these. And in fact, sea run cutthroat generally aren't very picky fish, but I had a few days in April this year fishing the pink salmon fry hatch where I didn't have any smaller muddlers. I only had some bigger ones because just generally what I fished, and they would not go for them. And I think it was just because they were too big. Because I went back with small ones a few days later, and I started having pretty good success on those fish. So the next cutthroat are aggressive generally. So I'm going to add some flash. You can use any flash you like, crystal flash, crinkle flash. I don't even remember what this flash is called, but it's very thin, thin strands. So I like it. I find it adds some nice movement to the fly. So I'm going to take probably 3 or 4 strands of this. And now if you have a thicker flash, you're going to want to do less strands, because if you do 3 or 4 strands of, for example, crinkle flash is fairly thick, you'll actually just start limiting the movement of the fly, and you'll also just kind of bury the colors of the deer hair and the mallard in the flash, so you don't want to do that either. So what I'm going to do here is I've got my 3 or 4 strands, and I'm actually going to fold it over my thread like so, and then pull it back, and I want this to lay just on top and a little bit on the sides even of that mallard. So now I've got it pinched on there, and I'm going to pull it back and kind of wrap that in. Oopsies. There we go. Just give that a couple wraps. And I did that a little long. That's a little wasteful. You can cut those a little better than I did there and try to save your flash, but that's okay. I'm now going to cut that slightly longer than my mallard, just slightly longer than the mallard. And the reason I do that is because if I cut it right flush to the mallard, you lose a little bit of profile. So the reason I like to have that flash slightly longer is because the profile of a little minnow would get thinner into the tail there. So if I leave the flash slightly longer, in my eyes it kind of mimics what a tail would look like as it tapers down and gets thinner towards the back. It probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference, to be honest, fishing, but it's just one of those things that I like to do, and it has been successful for me, this fly. So there we go. That's good to go. The next and the final material is just some deer hair. Now, there's different types of deer hair you can get. You can get the deer body hair, which is what I'm using here. And then you can also get the deer belly hair. Now the belly hair is much more hollow, and it'll spin a lot more. So if I was doing a full head on this muddler with deer hair all around, I would want to use the belly hair just because it spins a lot nicer. In this case, I actually don't want my deer hair to go all the way around like a typical muddler minnow would. So I'm actually going to use quite a sparse amount of deer hair for this fly, a lot less than you would typically use tying a muddler. And again, the reason for that is just to maintain that sparse profile, to kind of mimic those salmon fry coming out. Yeah, so just sort of like about that much. You can see that's not much. It's flared out quite a bit right now, but if I sort of pinch that back, you can see it's quite a sparse amount of deer hair. Some people also like to stack the deer hair so all the tips are even length. I don't like to do that, and again, if I have a few tips that are longer, it kind of gives me that profile that I'm looking for of having it thin out into the tail of the fly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay that over top of the mallard and the flash there, and I like to have the longest tips of the deer hair the same length as my flash. So there's going to be some that are shorter and some that are longer. I don't want to go super long. Not that it wouldn't fish well. The thing that you're going to run into if you have super long wing is when you're casting, this deer hair is going to wrap around that hook sometimes, and now it's going to get stuck underneath like that while you're trying to fish, and it's going to ruin the swim of your fly, and it's going to ruin that profile a little bit. So you don't want to make this super long. You don't want it to be dramatically longer than the bend of your hook there. Otherwise it'll wrap around it. So right about there, I'm going to tighten this up a little bit here. There we go. Right about there looks good to me. I'm going to pinch that nice and tight. I don't want that to move. And again, I'm going to do that trick where I go around loose and then I pull up. And that's going to keep that deer hair where I want it. And now if I only do a wrap or two, I can kind of adjust to get that all on the top. I don't want anything on the bottom, or not too much at least. I'm going to give that a few more wraps just to get it nice and tight. And then I'm going to call that good. Now I'm going to fold those back just so I can get a couple of wraps right at the front here. And you're going to see I'm using quite a lot of red thread right on the head of the fly there. The reason for that is when a bait fish is fleeing or a minnow is fleeing from something, they open up their gills to allow more oxygen like into their body, I guess, and that allows them to swim away faster and for longer. So I'm trying to kind of mimic that with the red thread on the profile of that fly. So now you can whip finish. I do like a weird whip finish, but just a little finish of the fly there. I'm going to cut my thread. And now I'm going to just trim away all these tag ends of the deer hair on this side. And just start kind of long for a minute just to get them all trimmed down. And you don't have to be super picky about these. It's really not going to make too much of a difference fishing if you have a perfect head on this fly. Now I'm just going to loosely kind of trim those down. I don't want them too long because I've got a bead head on there that's already giving this fly a bit of a head, so I don't need a head with this deer hair. If I was doing a dry muddler or a beadless muddler, and then I'd be using the belly hair, deer belly hair, I would have a lot more deer hair and it would go all the way around. All my thread would be buried in that, and then I'd be a lot more careful about trimming those. I'd try to make it into a nice little head. But anyways, that is my favorite beach muddler minnow. So you can kind of see the profile there. It's not too dense. It's pretty sparse. And I like it even as a few of these deer hairs get ripped out when I'm fishing it. You can see on the bottom there's quite a lot of red thread exposed, and again, that's just to give that profile of a fish opening up his gills, fleeing something. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I'm going to try to do some more of these videos, so if you liked it, let me know. And if you're catching fish on a fly like this, let me know too. That's pretty cool. So thanks everyone.